It was a gray Monday morning in D.C. when the envelope arrived. Thick, heavy, official, stamped with a gold federal seal and no return address. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had opened hundreds of letters in her career, but this one made her hand still for half a second before slicing the edge open. Inside was a subpoena, not for someone else, for her. And it wasn't just a procedural request or a witness formality. It was a formal order to testify in a federal case. She flipped through the pages quickly. Legalese, vague language, deliberately obtuse. Then her eyes landed on the name presiding over the proceedings, Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Her brow furrowed. A sitting Supreme Court justice overseeing a federal inquiry involving a sitting member of Congress? That wasn't normal. That wasn't standard. That was strategic. Jasmine stood there motionless in her office for a full minute, the paper in her hand growing heavier by the second. Then she picked up her phone and dialed her legal advisor. "Read it," she said. The line was quiet for a beat. Then his voice. "They're reaching. It's not illegal, but it's not normal either. And the fact they've placed Barrett on it? They're making an example out of you." "Because I talk too much?" she asked. "Because your voice carries too far," he answered. Jasmine's voice hardened. "Then let them hear me." 2 days later, Jasmine Crockett boarded a flight to the hearing. She wore no dramatic colors. No defiant slogan on her shirt. Just a navy blue pantsuit, crisp and clean, her natural curls pulled back with precision. She was not there to perform. She was there to endure. Outside the federal courthouse, reporters swarmed like bees drawn to heat. Cameras were already focused on her steps before her heel hit the first concrete slab. But Jasmine didn't slow, didn't smile, didn't shrink. Inside, the courtroom was colder than expected, too clean, too quiet, like the kind of place where power lives in whispers instead of roars. She sat at the witness table. The bailiff gave her a nod. Then the doors opened. Justice Amy Coney Barrett entered, robed, unreadable. For a second, their eyes met. A flicker of recognition passed between them, not personal, not warm, but sharp, like two blades drawn in the same room. Barrett sat. "We are here today to gather testimony relevant to case number 24 FR 2025, she began, her voice tight as piano wire. "This is a federal proceeding. Any disruption, defiance, or deviation from protocol will not be tolerated." The air thinned. Jasmine didn't blink. The questions started simple, procedural, unthreatening, until they weren't. They dug into her past statements, her political positions, even her tweets. She leaned forward once. "With all due respect, I was called to testify on oversight, not on opinions I've held in public as a legislator." Barrett's voice sliced the air. "The witness will not speak out of turn. With all due respect, I will not be used as a political punching bag in a courtroom," Jasmine replied. "If there's a charge, name it. If not, let's stop pretending this is justice." Gasps, whispers. The courtroom shifted, from sterile to electric. Barrett tightened her lips. "Let the record show the witness has been warned." But Jasmine wasn't playing defense. Not anymore. Outside, word had already leaked. Clips from the courtroom, Jasmine's sharp reply, Barrett's reprimand, were going viral before the hearing even recessed. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag let her speak, hashtag Crockett vs. Barrett, hashtag contempt of power. And in living rooms, break rooms, dorm rooms, people started paying attention. Not because Jasmine was loud, but because she was precise. This wasn't a meltdown. It was a woman holding the line. The next morning, the media had multiplied. So had the tension. Inside the courtroom, Barrett sat like stone, perfectly still. But everything else had changed. Jasmine's legal counsel leaned in. "They're going to bait you. Don't fall for it." "I'm not falling for anything," Jasmine said. "But I'm not walking on eggshells either." The prosecution came harder this time. Fundraisers, protests, community events where she'd spoken truth that didn't fit neatly in a courtroom transcript. They put up a slide. A tweet Jasmine had liked 3 years ago, criticizing a ruling Barrett had made before joining the Supreme Court. "This speaks to your state of mind," the prosecutor said. Jasmine narrowed her eyes. "You're seriously putting a social media like on the record? It reveals bias. I'm not on trial. You're a witness under oath." "I'm a public servant under pressure," Jasmine shot back. "And if I am on trial, you're doing a bad job proving anything." Barrett didn't flinch. "Congresswoman Crockett, this is your final warning. If you continue, disrupt, or respond." Jasmine cut in, "Because those aren't the same thing. And you know it." Barrett's gavel hovered, then slowly lowered. "Proceed," she muttered to the prosecutor. The rest of the day blurred. But something had cracked open. Jasmine didn't shout, didn't storm out, didn't throw papers. She endured, held the line. Her presence alone was defiance enough. And outside that courthouse, the crowd had doubled. Handmade signs, microphones, voices. Some shouted, most waited. They weren't waiting for sound bites. They were waiting for someone to survive the storm, without bending. By the third day, the air in the courtroom had changed. It no longer felt like a legal proceeding. It felt like a performance of power, staged beneath marble columns and legal jargon. Jasmine Crockett walked in with her shoulders square and her spine steel. The guards at the door stood a little straighter. The cameras were positioned with clinical precision. Justice Barrett didn't look up as Jasmine entered. Not a nod, not a glance, just the shuffle of papers and a crisp voice declaring, "This court is prepared to resume testimony. The witness will take the stand." Jasmine rose and walked with purpose. Her heels echoed like a drumbeat against the cold floor, steady, deliberate, unapologetic. She sat, adjusted the microphone, and folded her hands. The prosecutor launched without hesitation. "Congresswoman Crockett, let's return to the issue of public trust. You've publicly questioned the impartiality of the judicial system. In your own words, you said there are people in power who hide behind procedure when they feel threatened by truth. Were you referring to this court?" Jasmine didn't flinch. "No," she said calmly, "but it seems like it applies." A soft gasp rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor shot a glance toward Barrett, but the judge remained still, expression unreadable. "Would you agree," the prosecutor pressed, "that your refusal to answer directly, your combative tone, and your willingness to undermine the authority of this bench show a blatant disregard for due process?" Jasmine leaned in slightly. "What I refuse is to sit here and pretend that what's happening is fair. This isn't about justice. It's about optics." Barrett's voice sliced through the air. "That's enough." Jasmine turned her gaze directly toward the judge. "With respect, it's not. Because while we're sitting here being told what we can and can't say, there are real people out there watching and learning exactly what this system does to voices it can't control." Barrett's tone turned to ice. "Congresswoman Crockett, this is your last interruption. If you speak again out of turn, I will exercise my authority and hold you in contempt. I suggest you choose your words carefully." Jasmine's attorney touched her arm, a silent plea for restraint. But Jasmine was already shaking her head, not in defiance but in principle. "I was raised to speak when something isn't right," she said. "Not when it's convenient, not when it's allowed, when it matters." The silence was instant and thick. Barrett's eyes narrowed. She lifted the gavel. "This court finds the witness in contempt. Remove her." There was a collective intake of breath in the room. "You're serious?" Jasmine asked, rising slowly. "You've repeatedly disrespected the authority of this court." "No," Jasmine said, her voice low but clear. "I've disrespected the abuse of it. And I'll do it again if it means telling the truth." The bailiff stepped forward, unsure. Jasmine didn't resist. She stood tall, letting the moment imprint itself onto every camera lens, every watching eye. She looked straight at Barrett. "You'll regret this." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Because outside those walls, the world was watching. And the story had already begun writing itself. As she was led from the courtroom, flashes exploded. Reporters shouted her name. She didn't speak. She didn't look down. She walked like someone who knew this wasn't the end, it was the beginning. By the time she was officially booked for contempt of court, the internet was already on fire. A video of her final words had been clipped, subtitled, and reposted thousands of times. Every caption read differently, but the message was the same: courage, defiance, integrity. Some critics called it grandstanding. Others called it disgraceful. But those who understood power, real power, saw something else. They saw the moment a courtroom tried to erase a voice, and that voice refused to disappear. Inside the courthouse, things began to shift. 2 former federal judges issued public statements within hours. They questioned the legitimacy of a Supreme Court justice presiding over such a politically charged hearing. Legal scholars began asking hard questions. Is this constitutional? Is this precedent? Or is this a spectacle masked in legalese? Jasmine sat in a holding room, silent but resolute. Her legal team scrambled behind the scenes. An emergency motion was filed, citing abuse of discretion and overreach. It was swift, aggressive, and unapologetic. This is not about courtroom decorum, the motion read. This is about silencing dissent. Outside, something else was happening. Support began pouring in, not from the predictable corners, but from the unexpected ones. Staffers from both sides of the aisle sent quiet messages. Law students organized rallies. And then the leak happened. A full, unedited video of the courtroom exchange appeared online. Anonymous, clean, devastating. It showed Jasmine calm. It showed Barrett severe. And it showed the moment of contempt for what it really was: punishment for presence. The video went viral instantly. It didn't need commentary. It didn't need spin. It spoke for itself. By sunrise, Jasmine was released on her own recognizance. Her attorney met her at the exit. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. She nodded. He nodded back. They overplayed it, he finally said. Jasmine gave a tired smile. Let's make sure that matters. That afternoon, her team filed a motion to vacate the contempt charge. But they didn't stop there. The motion called for Barrett's recusal from all further proceedings. The language was firm. The tone was clear. This wasn't a legal rebuttal. It was a statement of principle. Justice, the motion read, cannot coexist with unchecked power. Barrett said nothing. No press release. No response. But behind the curtain, the cracks were beginning to show. Court clerks whispered about the fallout. Judicial aides looked uneasy. The silence wasn't composed. It was calculated. And to Jasmine and her team, that silence said everything. This had never been about law. It had been about control. But the plan had failed. Because what was meant to shame had instead ignited. What was meant to silence had gone viral. Jasmine Crockett hadn't raised her voice. She'd raised the stakes. By the end of the week, protests had formed outside the courthouse. Not massive, not chaotic, but visible, focused. The signs didn't carry partisan slogans. They didn't chant names. They carried messages: let her speak. Power shouldn't silence truth. This is what resistance looks like. Jasmine Crockett hadn't made a single public statement since her release. No tweets. No appearances. Her silence wasn't uncertainty. It was preparation. Her team, meanwhile, was building more than a defense. They were building a case. Not just against the contempt order, but against the very proceedings that had tried to crush her. Cable news aired the courtroom footage in primetime. Analysts debated, legal scholars dissected, and the public watched, mesmerized by the rawness of it all. The footage spoke louder than any editorial. No yelling, no theatrics, just a black congresswoman, seated, composed, speaking truth. And a Supreme Court justice, cloaked in silence and severity, ordering her silenced. One after another, law professors published open letters. Civil rights attorneys posted legal breakdowns on social media. Commentators from all sides echoed a singular point. Contempt of court is not a tool to crush speech. It is a tool to maintain order. And Crockett hadn't disrupted anything. She had spoken with the clarity the system wasn't prepared for. Within days, over 30 lawmakers co-signed a joint letter condemning the hearing. They didn't just question the legality of Barrett's actions, they questioned the ethics. The erosion of respect for elected voices, especially ones that challenge power and tradition, was being called out. And the letter didn't shy away from naming what everyone else was dancing around: racism, sexism, and fear. Fear of the voices that don't play by the rules that were never written for them. Meanwhile, Jasmine's legal team prepared something larger. A petition to the Judicial Conference. A formal review of Barrett's conduct. And behind closed doors, they began assembling testimony. Not from political operatives, but from legal experts, constitutional scholars, and even retired judges. What had happened wasn't just irregular. It was dangerous. And someone had to say it, on the record. When Jasmine finally appeared again, it was deliberate. She didn't choose a studio. She didn't stand behind a podium with senators flanking her. She stood alone, on the steps of the courthouse, under gray skies and a light drizzle. She wore white, clean, composed. Her hair was natural, her expression unreadable. She stepped forward, the marble behind her streaked with rain, and began speaking with the same tone she used in the courtroom, measured, calm, unshaken. "I want to thank every person who's reached out," she began, "not because this has been easy, but because it's been necessary. What happened inside that courtroom wasn't just about me. It was about how we handle power. How we react when someone refuses to shrink." She paused. "I was held in contempt of court not because I broke the law, but because I wouldn't break myself to fit into a system that punishes boldness from people who look like me." Another pause. The crowd was still. "Judge Barrett may have the bench," she said, "but she does not have the final word." And with that, she turned and walked away. That clip alone received over 15 million views within 24 hours. Reaction videos poured in. News networks aired it unedited. That same evening, the Department of Justice issued a rare statement. "We are aware of recent proceedings involving Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. We will be reviewing the conduct and judicial handling of the matter." It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. This wasn't just a viral moment. It had entered the system. Inside the court, Barrett remained silent. No press conferences, no denials, but rumors swirled. Court insiders whispered about pressure building. Supreme Court aides spoke in hypotheticals. Should justices be allowed to preside over politically charged hearings? Is there precedent? Is there accountability? The questions had left law school lecture halls and entered the national conversation. By midweek, Jasmine's team filed their final motion. A formal appeal to vacate the contempt charge and a request to disqualify Barrett from any further involvement. The filing ended with a single, devastating sentence. This court was not used to uphold justice, but to punish speech. That cannot be allowed to stand. The public waited, and the court, for once, had to listen. The decision came quietly, as these things often do. Jasmine wasn't present. Neither was Barrett. A panel of senior judges reviewed the filings. No cameras, no drama, just facts. And the ruling that followed shook the legal world. The contempt charge against Jasmine Crockett was vacated in full. The panel found no legal foundation for her removal. Her statements, while assertive, did not warrant contempt. But more than that, the ruling criticized the very nature of the proceedings. It questioned the impartiality of Justice Barrett. And it stated, without ambiguity, that silencing a witness, an elected official, under such circumstances represented a breach of the principles the court was sworn to protect. The moment the ruling dropped, it spread like fire. Jasmine's name trended globally. Editorials, interviews, opinion pieces, they all followed the same arc. This wasn't just a courtroom battle. It had become a referendum on power and speech. Lawmakers, activists, even celebrities joined the conversation. But Jasmine didn't celebrate. That afternoon, she held a short press conference. Not at a hotel ballroom. Not in D.C. She stood in a small community center. The same neighborhood where she once worked as a public defender. She stood before a crowd of teachers, students, janitors, and old friends. "This isn't about me," she said. This is about what happens when truth becomes a threat. When standing firm is treated like stepping out of line. Contempt of court was never meant to protect egos. It was meant to protect order. But this week, we saw how even that can be twisted. And the question now is, who gets to speak without being punished for it? The crowd listened, quiet, respectful. The answer, she said softly, should never depend on race, on gender, or on whether your voice makes the powerful uncomfortable. She paused, looked down, then up again. They tried to make me regret speaking. But the only thing I regret is that so many others still feel they can't. The press didn't interrupt. They didn't need to. Because in that room, and across the country, something had shifted. And no ruling, no robe, could turn it back. Barrett disappeared from the public eye. No media statements. No television appearances. No commentary from her chambers. At first, the silence seemed strategic. A waiting game. But as days turned into weeks, it became something else. An absence that spoke louder than any defense. Legal analysts speculated she was being advised to let the backlash fade. To outlast the outrage. But this wasn't fading. This wasn't noise. It was a movement. In legal circles, debates erupted. Should a sitting Supreme Court justice be allowed to preside over politically sensitive cases? Should ethical guidelines be redefined? Could Congress intervene? Could anyone? The ripple effects reached far beyond law schools and newsrooms. Students began referencing Jasmine's testimony in university debates. Civil rights groups held panels dissecting every word she had said. Even educators began using the footage in classrooms, a real-time lesson on civic resistance, power, and accountability. Jasmine didn't bask in the spotlight. She continued to show up to work, kept her meetings, voted on legislation, but she carried herself differently now. Not heavier, not louder, just with the calm weight of someone who had survived an attempt to silence her, and had emerged as the one with the nation's attention. Then came the formal congressional inquiry. A subcommittee was convened to examine judicial conduct in the Barrett hearing. Not just whether the contempt charge had merit, but whether a Supreme Court justice had overstepped in a case laced with political undertones. The tone had shifted from curiosity to accountability, from commentary to consequence. Behind closed doors, members of the Senate Judiciary Committee began holding quiet briefings. Legal scholars were invited to provide input. Experts in constitutional law drafted memos. Former federal judges weighed in, some publicly, most privately. And what they said echoed one another. Barrett had made it personal. And when a judge makes it personal, the robe loses its authority, not in law, perhaps, but in trust. Jasmine never called for Barrett's removal. She didn't need to. The system was moving on its own now. Investigative reporters uncovered internal memos. Leaked emails between clerks suggested discomfort in Barrett's chambers. One aide had reportedly warned, weeks earlier, that placing her on the hearing risked ethical entanglements and irreparable optics. The warning was ignored. Still, Jasmine didn't declare victory. She understood something deeper. This wasn't about one judge. It was about an entire architecture that had, for too long, depended on silence, expected deference, demanded obedience, especially from women, especially from people of color, and most of all from anyone unwilling to play the game. One rainy afternoon, Jasmine returned to the courthouse steps. This time, there were no lawyers, no aides, no flashbulbs popping like gunfire. Just her. A few reporters stood with umbrellas. A few supporters held signs. She approached the mic with an ease that came not from rehearsed lines, but from lived truth. "I've been thinking a lot about silence," she began. "How it's demanded, how it's disguised as decorum, how it's used not to create peace, but to suppress challenge." The rain dripped gently off the edge of her coat. She didn't flinch. "This didn't start because I broke a rule. It started because I didn't break." And that, to some, was the real threat. Her voice never rose, but it cut through the gray afternoon like lightning. When you refuse to shrink, when you refuse to fold into a shape that makes others more comfortable, They don't always argue with your words. They argue with your presence. And when presence becomes resistance, they punish it. They call it disorder, contempt, disruption. But what they really mean is, you made them feel powerless. She paused, her eyes sweeping across the small gathering. There is a cost to telling the truth. A real one. It can look like headlines. It can look like handcuffs. But the price of silence is heavier. She looked directly into the cameras. I won't pay that price. Not now. Not ever. The clip circulated immediately. And something remarkable happened. It wasn't just politicians or professors who reposted it. It was mothers, factory workers, high school students, veterans, people who had never watched a hearing in their lives. They shared it with captions like, "This is what bravery looks like," and "I needed this today." Because Jasmine wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking into a void that too many had sat in alone. That weekend, the nation's largest legal association announced a new panel, an ethical oversight body meant to review judicial behavior in politically charged settings. It was purely advisory. It had no enforcement power. But it didn't need one. It was a sign that even institutions were waking up. One senator, privately, off the record, said it best. We didn't realize how deep the rot had gotten until someone banged on the walls loud enough for us to hear the cracks. And Jasmine, she wasn't banging. She was whispering, calm, certain, refusing to vanish. She returned to Capitol Hill that Monday not to give speeches but to do her job. The same one they had tried to discredit her from. And she did it without bitterness. Without arrogance. She didn't carry revenge in her voice. She carried resolve. In a closed-door committee meeting that week, a colleague leaned over and whispered, "They thought they'd teach you a lesson." Jasmine smiled gently and replied, "They did. Just not the one they intended." The storm had passed, but the ground it left behind wasn't the same. Inside courtrooms, judges began to feel the weight of their tone. Law students quoted Jasmine Crockett in essays about voice and authority. Panels were convened on ethics not because a memo required it, but because the people watching now demanded it. The video of her being escorted from the courtroom was no longer just a clip. It had become an emblem, a quiet declaration that systems, no matter how sacred they seem, are still accountable to the people they aim to govern. But Jasmine never claimed to be a hero. She returned to her district not with fanfare but with listening. She visited the same schools she once spoke at as a lawyer. She met with young organizers who had watched her story unfold not through textbooks, but through their phones, in real time with real stakes. One student asked her, "Weren't you scared?" And Jasmine, sitting in a folding chair, looked her in the eye and said, "Yes. But I was more scared of what would happen if I said nothing." That became the quote etched on posters, stitched into protest signs, painted across murals in unexpected corners of the country. More scared of silence than punishment. It wasn't dramatic. It was real. In Washington, the Judiciary Oversight Panel met for the first time in years to discuss the scope of Supreme Court justices presiding over federal inquiries. While no formal sanctions were filed against Barrett, the committee issued a public statement expressing grave concern over the handling of the Crockett hearing and recommended immediate reforms to prevent future ethical breaches. For Jasmine, it wasn't vindication. It was progress. She knew the system wouldn't shift overnight. But cracks had been carved, deep and undeniable. Not just by her resistance, but by the people who refused to look away once they saw what had been done. A year passed. Then too, Barrett continued her tenure on the bench, though more quietly than before. She declined most public engagements. Declined to speak at forums where her presence might be questioned. She wasn't removed, but her robe carried a different kind of weight now, not the weight of authority, but of scrutiny. As for Jasmine, she kept showing up. She authored a bill that would protect federal witnesses, including elected officials, from contempt charges when no clear evidence of disruption could be established. It passed with bipartisan support. Quietly, cleanly. And while she never named Barrett in her speeches again, The shadow of that hearing remained present in her advocacy. She talked about the importance of fearless testimony. She talked about what it meant to challenge procedure that masks injustice. She talked about voice, not as performance but as power. On the anniversary of her contempt charge, she stood again on the steps of the same courthouse. This time, there was no rain, just sun. The crowd was bigger, more organized. Teachers brought students, elders brought grandchildren, reporters returned, though this time they came not to chase chaos, but to witness clarity. Jasmine wore no special suit, just a soft gray dress and a pair of flats. She didn't bring notes. When I stood here a year ago, she began, I had just been silenced. But today, I stand because that silence didn't hold. The crowd stood still, the city around her quiet enough to feel the moment. I didn't speak out to become a headline. I didn't speak to go viral. I spoke because it was the only thing I had left that hadn't been taken from me. She let that linger. Since then, I've seen young girls speak louder in classrooms. I've seen young men learn that dignity isn't measured by silence. And I've seen elders cry because, for once, the courtroom echoed with truth instead of power. She looked into the distance, not at cameras, but somewhere further. This isn't the end of a chapter. It's the beginning of an era, one where voice isn't a privilege. It's a birthright. A little girl near the front held up a handmade sign. Speak even when they tell you not to. Jasmine smiled gently, and as the crowd applauded, not wildly, but warmly, she stepped away from the podium. The cameras didn't chase her this time. They followed her, quietly, respectfully. The montage that later aired didn't need narration. It showed her walking alone into the crowd, shaking hands, hugging strangers, smiling at a baby balanced on a father's shoulder. The final shot was of her turning briefly toward the courthouse one last time. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to, because her story wasn't about loudness. It was about refusing to vanish. And as the screen faded to black, the message remained. When systems punish you for speaking, speak louder. When power silences you, turn silence into fire. And if they try to make an example out of you, make it one worth remembering.